All right, for more on the current developments on the repatriation of SANDF soldiers from the DRC, we're joined by SABC NEWS International Editor Sophie Mokoena. Sophie, great to have you with us. Let's first get an update. We know the bodies of our fallen soldiers are in transit. Just talk us through the repatriation route now.
Well, we heard this morning from those on the ground that they left Goma and they went through Rwanda, but a very short route in Rwanda and on the way to Uganda. As you know, that South Africa was quite firm that they would want the repatriation be done in Uganda, and therefore this is where it's going to happen. And earlier on, they were en route to Uganda. It's not clear whether the bodies will be flown from Entebbe Airport or they are going to use one of the base there in terms of the UN. As you know, that UN has got a base in Uganda. And therefore, that's what we know. And we saw some visuals from media in the Great Lakes region showing the vehicle and also the truck that's believed to be carrying those bodies of the fallen South Africans. And also, you know that Malawi and also Tanzania lost 2 each country, and therefore it is 18 in total, 14 South Africans, 2 Malawians, and 2 Tanzanians.
A very somber moment for South Africa, but most certainly just the news that the fallen heroes' bodies are in transit is some sort of a relief for the families and South Africans in general. But do we know if indeed they will arrive in the evening or the early hours of the morning? Because there were reports that it would be tonight.
Well, I think perhaps the information is that it's tonight. But the reality is when you repatriate someone who has passed on or bodies, it's not an easy process. It's not like the evacuation. You still have to do a lot of paperwork where you have this repatriation taking place. Those countries would also want to ensure that the health processes as per the laws of that country are met, but also other issues related to ensuring that you are handing over these bodies to the right people or the right country, and therefore it's not an easy process. But it is done under the auspice of the United Nations. As you know, that particularly from South Africa, some of those fallen soldiers were members of MONUSC, not necessarily Summit DRC. And therefore the UN is doing this process. And I think a decision was taken that it should be the UN that is at the forefront, because you know right now there's tension among countries that are affected and stakeholders, and perhaps the neutral body would be your UN, the organization that is charged with responsibility of bringing the world together, but also maintenance of peace. And therefore, I think that could be the reason why MONUSC is doing this.
Now, is it just the fallen soldiers or the wounded are also being brought back to the country?
The information we got that we have to verify, and I think South Africa will issue a statement, is that you also have health personnel. 3 of those 7 health personnel, it is the South Africans. And therefore, that's what we know for now. We don't have much, but I think later we will get better information from South Africa. But you heard the president earlier on pointing out that they are working hard to repatriate these fallen soldiers. And I think this process has started, and South Africa will start speaking with more convincing voice when they have been handed over to South Africa, because when you still have this process where you have to go through different countries, you want to wait and ensure that those processes in the respective countries are done. You don't perhaps upset or perhaps get disappointed when something has to change because of the laws of that country. And earlier on when I spoke to some people, I was told that there was an agreement that wherever they go through, it will be a very solemn event, and they will ensure that the dignity is respected, unlike what we saw 2 weeks ago, where we saw those mercenaries being paraded. There's an agreement that these are Africans, and Africans must respect each other.
Then to the SADC and East African Community meeting on the conflict. A lot is at stake with these peace efforts. We all know this is not the first attempt at peace talks. We remember the Luanda process back in 2022. It collapsed. President Kagame was insisting at that time that President Tshisekedi include M23 in the talks, but Tshisekedi insisted that the peace talks should take place at a state-to-state level. You cannot have a rebel group being elevated to that level and engaged at that level. What lessons can be learned, Sophie, from those failed talks that could be taken into these talks?
I think what is critical is for leaders to accept that if you exclude a particular group that is involved in conflict, you are not going to address that conflict with guns. And therefore, an inclusive process is quite important, like the Sun City talks some years ago. You had even rebels being part of these discussions. You leave it to the facilitator to bring everybody on board. Nobody is saying that the rebels must sit on the table with heads of state, but heads of state can discuss and say we appoint so and so to facilitate the talks, and those talks will be inclusive. That's how you do it. If you don't do that, others are going to continue to take arms and fight, and you are not going to resolve the problem. So I hope that leaders will accept that you must have an inclusive process, no matter how they feel. If really they care about the lives of Africans that they claim to lead and love so much, and therefore it has to be an inclusive process. But you can hear the tone from different leaders who have spoken that they believe in an inclusive process. Of course, this time around you might not have the M23 rebel on the table, but I think later we are going to see inclusive process. And remember, in the DRC, you have many other armed groups, and therefore you have to take that into consideration.
Sophie, as always, thank you very much for that reportage. That's Sophie Mokoena, SABC News International Editor, with me in studio here, speaking to us on efforts to repatriate our fallen soldiers from the Democratic Republic of Congo.